Hey, it's Kristan Hawkins. Welcome to Explicitly Pro-Life. Make sure you have subscribed to this podcast. This week, I'm going to do something different, so I hope you're prepared. I hope you have your pens and paper out. I'm going to give you a history lesson. One of my favorite things to do every year when I talk with our Students for Life fellows, our Wilberforce fellows, our college fellows, our high school Stevens fellows, is give kind of a brief primer of the history of the pro-life movement. And over the years, I found that this is one of my most requested kind of speeches to pro-life students. Pro-life student leaders find this fascinating, as did I, which is why I kind of wrote this presentation for our students. I actually wrote this presentation using a little bit of political and legal history, and then also having conversations. I had a dear friend who served in the Ronald Reagan administration, has kind of been serving in the pro-life movement ever since. So she firsthand witnessed a lot of the events that I speak about. So I want to start by talking about why do we care about history? I mean, I was a history minor in college. My husband was a history major. My kids are taught a lot of history. In fact, we just went to Washington, D.C. this summer for Students for Life's All Team Week, and my kids were on history overload because we kept taking them to the battlefields, to the monuments, to the archives. They finally gave up after the third battlefield and just started playing their iPads. But Jonathan and I were really excited. But why do we care about history? Why is history so important? Well, that old adage of those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. That's so true, especially in the pro-life movement. We actually see today, arguments and disagreements over strategies and tactics in the pro-life movement that have literally been happening for the past 30 years just on repeat. I think it's important for us to understand our history as a movement, to understand the mistakes we might have made, the strategic mistakes we might have made, to understand, especially when you're talking about infighting that's happened in the pro-life movement, which, by the way, is not uncommon to social movements. I think sometimes people think that, oh my gosh, this organization doesn't like this organization, or they don't get along. That's so rare. That's actually pretty common in social movements because you have a bunch of type A personalities who've all sacrificed a lot, many who believe they're called to this movement by their creator. So then telling people that you think they're doing something wrong doesn't always work out so well. I've learned personally of that. So I think it's important for us to as a movement, understand our history, see where we've come from, learn from our mistakes. I think it will help us shape our future and to make better decisions moving forward for our movement as we seek a post-Roe America and get closer and closer to it. So let's get started. And first, I want to just start by going over some laws and when laws were enacted and when different Supreme Court cases. And then towards the end, I'm going to get into more of the nitty gritty, different organizations, different strategies. And I'm going to do this in a way that hopefully is not insulting to anyone. Although I do find when I talk about the history of the pro-life movement, in fact, when I talk about anything, I usually find that I've offended at least a few people in the room. So sorry if I offend you. I didn't mean to. And make sure you leave a comment and I'll take care of it. Maybe. Okay, so 1821, that's where I start this little history. The state of Connecticut is the first state to ban abortions after quickening. 1873, supported by the American Medical Association, AMA, the Comstock Act actually banned the dissemination of information on birth control. So AMA has come a far way, baby, from 1873. 1875, in a speech called Social Purity, suffragists and first wave feminist Susan B. Anthony actually spoke out openly against abortion. Other suffragists of the time openly opposed abortion. This is important. One of our supporters and one of my dear friends actually owns the birthplace of Susan B. Anthony, and they've turned her birthplace into a museum, and they have a whole wall on Restalism, which is what abortion was called after Madame Restel, a legal abortion abortionists in New York State. And they actually have a whole wall dedicated to the suffragists, the first wave feminists, opposition to abortion. This is something that today's feminist movement likes to ignore. And if you bring it up, the usual response on the campus is, "Oh, you're just whitewashing the fact that Susan B. Anthony was a racist." And so instead of actually addressing the actual thing that the first wave feminists were uniformly opposed to abortion, that they try to change the subject, which, by the way, Susan B. Anthony was not a racist. So 1890, abortion is regulated by statutes advocated by the AMA. Abortion is permitted upon conferral of one or more physicians who believe the procedure is necessary to preserve the life of the mother. 1920s gave rise to the birth control movement led by Margaret Sanger, who founded the American Birth Control League, which became Planned Parenthood. Margaret Sanger is a eugenics proponent, open eugenics proponent, opens what becomes the largest abortion chain in America. If you want to know more about this time period in American history, I would encourage you to check out Maafa 21, MAAFA21.com. That was a documentary done by Life Dynamics, Mark Crutcher and Life Dynamics, a few years back, and it really profiled the beginning of the eugenics movement and where eugenics came from. Charles Galwin, I think it was Gall. It's late. He was actually the cousin of Charles Darwin, and he was the founder of the eugenics movement. They took Darwin's beliefs, and that's what that kind of spawned the eugenics movement. Eugenics, if you've never heard the term, it's the study, it's the belief that the possibility in quote unquote improving the qualities of the human species or human population. And eugenics can be considered positive or negative eugenics. Usually, it's by means of discouraging reproduction by persons having genetic defects or those who have presumed inheritable undesirable traits. So that's a negative eugenics. Or positive eugenics would be encouraging reproduction by persons presumed to have inheritable desirable traits. So you have the eugenics movement actually starts in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. It's very popular in the upper white middle class circles, and it's racist and classist and everything you can imagine it is. So, but that's really where you'll see if you watch Maafa 21, they talk about the Birth Control League and Planned Parenthood, and why there was this promotion of birth control. It wasn't really created to be this great invention for women's lives. It was for negative eugenics to make sure that those who have inheritable undesirable traits or those who are poor, disadvantaged, aren't reproducing too quickly. 1865, the Supreme Court, this is the first Supreme Court case I want to touch upon, invalidated a Connecticut law in Griswold v. Connecticut that prevented the use of contraceptives for married couples. This was a vote of 7-2. They said that the Connecticut law violated the quote-unquote right to marital privacy. This is important, and sometimes in the pro-life movement, folks are like, we shouldn't talk about contraception. It's too difficult to talk about. It has mass approval. A majority of women in America are on some form of contraception or been prescribed some form of contraception. So we should just keep it off the table. I agree. When you're trying to talk to somebody about abortion and they believe that abortion up until the moment of birth is right and is moral, not really a good way to start a conversation by talking about contraception. However, I do think this is something we do have to address because we have abortion today. We have Roe versus Wade. We have Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton because of Griswold v. Connecticut. It's all linked, right? So I was giving a talk on a college campus in May. I was at the campus where they burned my the banner that had my face on it and set it blaze when it was still connected to the building. So you can obviously guess the school was very hostile. We had like 300 students turn out, and they were all protesting and lots of police presence. And at one point in my presentation, I said, a very natural consequences of two heterosexuals engaging in sex is the creation of a unique whole living human life. And when you engage in sex willingly, you're accepting that that's a consequence of your behavior. And you could have heard a pin drop in this room, because it was like I was presenting all new information. That the fact that when two heterosexuals have sex, if they can actually produce another human being, like it was like these two things have been so disconnected. Why have they been disconnected? Contraception. Why do we have abortion today? Because the definition of sex changed, and sex wasn't about two people who have committed to spend their lives together, producing a family and expressing their love. It was about just having fun, and so you had to have contraception to protect you, to make sure you don't have any accidents or produce another human being in the process of this fun. And we know the contraception isn't foolproof. Condoms have an 18% annual failure rate. Birth control pills have a 9% annual failure rate. By the way, I would never get into an airplane that had an 18% or 9% annual failure rate. And so then abortion had to be presented. So 1965, Griswold v. Connecticut, big important case. Also important, what starts happening in the 60s is, there is a case being made for the legalization of abortion in our country. So, and the left is very, very, very good about using a tragedy, using a story, and never letting that tragedy go to waste. In fact, Rahm Emanuel, President Obama's chief of staff, has openly said, never let a good tragedy go to waste. And he was very good at that. And this is a Saul Alinsky kind of tactic. And we saw it for the push for the legalization of abortion in Ireland. They took a tragic case there and made it be the push. And the facts of the whole case actually were wrong. And how the media took the story and ran with it, and what the public actually thought happened didn't even happen. So 1961, Sherry Finkbein, she is a local Phoenix child TV show host. She has kids. She's married. She and her husband are on a European vacation. They purchase over-the-counter sedatives, bring those sedatives back home. She takes 36 of these sedative pills that she buys in Europe in the early stages of her fifth pregnancy, unaware that those sedatives contained a drug called thalidomide, which can cause deformity in a preborn child, meaning the child can be born without a limb or deformed limbs. Her physician, once she finds out that she's been taking these drugs, recommends that she obtain a therapeutic abortion. This is the only type of abortion that's permitted at the time in Arizona. To politicize the danger of thalidomide, she actually goes public with her story. She goes to the Arizona Republic. She's promised it's going to be anonymous, but her identity is not kept secret. Following the publication of the story about what's happened and how she plans on having this abortion, the hospital in which she plans to have this therapeutic abortion says that, we're not really going to do this, that we don't want to do this. We're canceling this abortion. They were unsure whether or not they would be prosecuted for going through with the abortion. She and her husband become public figures. They try to fight the hospital. They go public, even more public with their story. She and her husband actually ultimately flew to Sweden and have a legal abortion in Sweden. This is huge. This is a big story because this is a story of a woman. She's, this isn't somebody who was careless. She was in a committed relationship. She was a mother. And the story is, she's just trying to do what's best for her child, that, this child is going to suffer. And so this is the best decision a mom can make, right? We hear this all the time. Don't eliminate the suffering, eliminate the sufferer. This is a huge story. It really, if you look at, and if you actually actually watch any. There was a documentary on abortion on Netflix just about a year ago. It was terrible and terribly biased, but they actually referred back to this, media story that the left used, saying that Sherry Finkbein story actually helped change public opinion on abortion. There was a poll from Gallup that said that 52% of Americans thought that she had done the right thing. 65. So this is the year Griswold comes out. The New York Times calls for a reform on abortion laws. There's one poll that goes out saying 77% of Americans want legalized abortion when the health of the mother is in danger. So they're using all of this. Planned Parenthood says, it uses Finkbein's story. So this is supposed to, get sympathetic reactions from Americans. So that you've got that going on. So you have this campaign going on. You also in the 1960s, and we've talked about this before, about the rise of second wave feminism, right? So you have this rise of second wave feminists coming out. You have Betty Friedan, her feminist mystique. So you've got Larry Ladder, a biographer of Margaret Sanger. He was the ED of the Hugh Moore Fund. Larry Ladder believed that in the 1970s, America and the world was going to face this impending population bomb, which, by the way, we still hear on college campuses all the time, that there's going to be so many people, there's going to be mass starvation, and he comes to believe that abortion is the final solution. In fact, he had a falling out with Margaret Sanger because of his beliefs in abortion. Ladder teams up with Dr. Nathanson, who is committing legal abortions in New York State. They formed NARAL, the National Association on the Repeal of Abortion Laws. They met with Friedan, convinced her to put abortion as the second edition of Feminist Mystique. So this is all happening in the 1960s. I like to point out when I'm speaking to students a lot that, they often hear, that only women have a say when it comes to abortion. And a lot of students I know that are young men are always fearful of, can I say something because students are going to attack me because of my gender? First, just nice thing to say is, one, genders never have arguments. So it doesn't really matter what gender you are. You still are entitled to an opinion. And you can still make a rational case against abortion. Two, it was actually men who really got abortion inserted into the second wave of feminism, into the women's rights movement. It was two men, Larry Ladder, Bernard Nathanson, and it was also 7 men in the Supreme Court, which made abortion legal for whatever reason in the United States. So we're going through 1960s. We have all this happen. We also have several states in late 1960s who start legalizing abortion in their states. You've got Hawaii, Colorado, President Ronald Reagan. So many conservatives are like, oh my gosh, Ronald Reagan is amazing. Ronald Reagan was great. He did some great things, and I'm a Reagan baby. But we have to remember, as governor of California, he did 2 horrendous things. He signed into law the Therapeutic Abortion Act of 1967, legalizing abortion in California, and also the no-fault divorce legislation in California. You think about 2 things that have fundamentally transformed American culture: divorce and abortion. And everything starts in California. That is why, like what we're doing at Students for Life is fighting SB 24, this legislation that's going to demand that college campuses in California dispense RU-486, the abortion pill. Not only are we trying to save lives in California, but we realize whatever starts in California is going to float across the country. And even the bill's authors are saying, oh yeah, this is just our test case. So you have several states in the late 60s who've started to legalize abortion. 1971, so you have the Comstock Act, which we talked about a little bit ago. That act is actually repealed. Abortion is now allowed under certain conditions in 14 states, and 4 states flat out guarantee a woman's right to choose pregnancy termination. So that's 1971. You have 1972. The Supreme Court used Griswold v. Connecticut to extend the right to privacy to unmarried couples. So now it's not just the contraceptive right in marriages, it's to any couples. January 22nd, 1973, the Supreme Court decision strikes down the state law that made abortion illegal in the first trimester in Roe versus Wade. And then the same day, they hand down Doe versus Bolton, which says that abortion can be legal in all 9 months to protect a loose definition of mother's health, which is used for whatever reason, a mother's mental health. You have to, when you hear the word mother's health, that's really what you're hearing, because when laws are written for health, it can be for whatever reason, physical or mental health. When pro-lifers talk about exceptions, well, every pro-life law always has an exception for the life of the mother, not the health of the mother, the physical life of the mother when it's a life or death situation. Now, shocking as it may sound, 1973, the pro-life movement's kind of asleep at the wheel during this time. The church in America wasn't prepared for this decision. The Baptist press actually praised Roe versus Wade. In 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention actually called for legal abortion in cases of rape, incest, clear evidence of fetal deformity, and carefully ascertained evidence of the likelihood of damage to the emotional, mental, physical health of the mother. So for whatever freaking reason. The Catholic Church speaks out loudly against this. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, USCCB, helped launch National Right to Life Committee. But National Right to Life Committee was never started as a quote-unquote religious organization. Their mission statement was very clear to remain focused on abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, and you actually won't find any mention that the USCCB helped start NRLC or was helpful there. The rest of the 1970s can kind of be described as a mobilization and education era for the pro-lifers. Nellie Gray was a Democrat working for a Democrat congressman on Capitol Hill. She started going to congressmen saying, did you hear about this Roe versus Wade decision? We have to do something, and was shocked and dismayed when no one really cared. So Nellie founds the March for Life. The first March for Life happened in 1974. She passed away just a few years ago in 2012. Her organization, the March for Life, still continues on. They hold the world's largest social mobilization every single year. In fact, no other cause in the history of the world turns out more people on an annual basis than the American pro-life movement. So suck it, feminists. All right. So 1970s, the pro-life movement's starting to figure out what we're going to do. A lot of folks thought that the Supreme Court was so extreme that surely Congress was going to take care of this. You have the Human Life Bill and the Human Life Amendment, which are presented in Congress that are supposed to ban abortion. If you remember from civics class, right, a bill's easier to pass, but can be easily reversed, where an amendment is an amendment to the Constitution. It's really hard to repeal an amendment. But it's really hard to get it into the Constitution. So those two legislative tactics start happening. 1976, you have the first Hyde Amendment, which is voted on. That has to be re-voted on every 2 years. That bars the use of federal Medicaid funding and other funds to provide. It says that federal Medicaid dollars can't pay for abortions except in cases of rape, incest, or severe and long-lasting damage to the woman's physical health. This is a significant victory. If you look at anything Dr. Michael New has written, Dr. New, I believe right now is a fellow for the Charlotte Lozier Institute. He's written about the impact of restrictions on abortion and state laws on abortion, and which restrictions on abortion are the most beneficial in actually reducing abortion numbers. Well, not surprisingly, the most beneficial laws are those that take away money, that make abortion expensive, and that make abortion not free for women. So this is huge. Up until 2016, everybody in Washington agreed on the Hyde Amendment, regardless if you were Democrat or Republican, pro-life, pro-choice. Everyone was like, yeah, taxpayer dollars should not be funding abortion. And still today, if you ask the majority of Americans, they would agree with that. In fact, over 70% of millennials in our poll actually say that they're opposed to using taxpayer dollars to fund abortions. But now things are changed. Actually, in the 2016 platform, the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, officially changed their platform to say that they were calling for abortion whenever, wherever, in all 9 months, and taxpayer funded. That was a significant change. President Obama, the most pro-abortion president in the history of our country, who oversaw the largest expansion of funding to the abortion industry, Obamacare. So, by the way, if you think Obamacare was a great pro-life law, you are you are very misguided, and we can have a whole podcast episode on that, Medicare for all. In fact, I should do that. So even though President Obama, being the pro-abortion stalwart advocate he was, I mean, the man literally argued against the infanticide law in Illinois when state senator, he even said he was for high. He probably wasn't, but he knew politically had to be. Just a month and a half ago, when the Democratic, all 20 whatever Democratic candidates for president had their little forum in South Carolina, they all said that they are for the repeal of Hyde. So just to show you how quickly things have changed and how extreme the abortion movement, the left has gotten in our country, you can see from President Obama's time to now they're calling for the repeal of Hyde. But thankfully, Hyde still is around, still exists, because we have a pro-life president who has clearly actually already told the Democrats, even when Nancy Pelosi took back as Speaker of the House, that he would veto anything that walked back our protections on Hyde. 1976, I kind of bring this up because I studied this in college. You kind of have the start of the moral majority, the beginning of the Christian right, the Jerry Falwell moral majority. This demographic kind of is hugely important because it gets Protestant evangelicals involved in the political process, which you'll see in the 1980s. In 1979, Supreme Court finds a Missouri requirement that abortions after the first trimester be performed in hospitals to be unconstitutional. That's a loss for us. However, in another decision, Bilotti versus Biard, the Supreme Court upheld a law requiring parental consent before abortions. This is important because this means the court is willing to impose some restrictions and some, freaking common sense here. 1981, Harris v. McRae, Supreme Court upheld limits on funding abortion, also said that states that participate in Medicaid were not required to fund medically necessary abortions. This is important because what we have today is you have the Hyde Amendment. And if you've ever thought about and try to research how Medicaid happens, so Medicaid is a block grant. So the federal government gives a percentage to the states to help pay for health care for those who are underserved, disadvantaged, can't afford health care in their state. And then the state actually matches what the federal government gives. So what this does is it allows states, we have the federal government saying, you can't use our Medicaid taxpayer dollars that we're sending your state for abortions. States can actually say, great, we're not going to use our state dollars to pay for abortions. Other states pay for it all. States like California, New York, they pick up the charge. 1981, Supreme Court, in another decision with the same name, Bilotti versus Biard, ruled that pregnant minors can petition the court for permission to have an abortion without their parental notification. That's called a judicial bypass. That's what we have today, where Planned Parenthood, if a young girl, a state passes a parental consent or a notification law, which are, important, and they actually do save lives, Planned Parenthood can just drive her. And we had one case one time where they were picking girls up from schools in Washington State. They can just drive her right to court, meet with the judge who's their friend, and the judge can write the judicial bypass. It's complete nonsense. 1984, former abortionist and founder of NARAL, Dr. Bernard Nathanson, releases a film. He becomes Christian and becomes pro-life. He releases a film that awoke the conscience of the nation, especially amongst Christians, called The Silent Scream. I highly encourage you to go to YouTube, check out The Silent Scream. It's a little hard for millennials and Gen Z to watch because it is black and white ultrasound. So it's like 2D, not the cool 3D, 4D. But it is one of, the first videos to show the violence of abortion. And it's just shocking because what happens in this video is they've film an abortion is happening via 2D ultrasound. And so you can see the fetus, the preborn child, trying to get away from the grasp of the abortionist tools. And it's definitely something you should check out on YouTube. If you ever need a shot in the ass to do more to end abortion, check it out. Now, the 1980s, the Reagan era. This is the decade, and this is the decade I get so upset when I looked at the history of the pro-life movement, because we really could have reversed Roe. We could have ended abortion, made it illegal. Challenge was that human beings got in the way. The election of 84, this is a huge success. You have a pro-life president. We have a pro-life Congress. Apparently, President Reagan had called all the pro-life leaders into a room and said, hey, how do we end this thing? And that was great. And then everybody started fighting. So we have the Human Life Bill I mentioned earlier, and then the Human Life Amendment. And so the pro-life movement in the 1980s, see if this sounds familiar to anyone, begins to argue over whether or not to push for the bill or the amendment. Like I said, the bill is easy to pass. President Reagan would have signed into law, would have banned abortions, but could be easily repealed, when Democrats took control. Human Life Amendment would have eliminated abortion, but would have been very difficult to get into our Constitution. So instead of supporting both, maybe passing the bill, then going for the amendment, the pro-life movement starts to fracture. There's an argument in the movement of, well, if you support the bill, you're not really pro-life enough. The true pro-lifers are for the amendment. So, yeah. Does it sound familiar? Sounds really familiar. I've heard this argument. So there's lots of disunity. One person leaves one big organization, pro-life organization, takes the donor list, starts another pro-life organization all over this issue. The amendment actually falls short of one vote from passage in the Senate. And that it wasn't because there weren't enough pro-lifers in the room. It was because they were fighting over the bill versus the amendment. This is bad. Beyond failing to pass the Human Life Bill or amendment, this unity there, kind of frustrates politicians on Capitol Hill, turns off some of those politicians from ever really engaging in the pro-life movement again. It also causes rifts in the pro-life movement that honestly still freaking exist today. That's what's one of the great things about learning the history of the pro-life movement. As someone who leads a pro-life organization, it made so much more sense once I understood the history of the pro-life movement as to why people don't work together or don't like each other. It turns people away, and not only it's just politicians, but also turned away grassroots activists. That moral majority, all of those Protestants who are in getting involved in politics. This drama just leaves a bad taste in everybody's mouth. So a lot of volunteers grow weary of these fights. Towards the end of the decade, though, two different types of activism come into play that are non-political. One was starting pregnancy resource centers, crisis pregnancy centers like they used to be called, CPCs. And then the other was Operation Rescue, taking the 1960s protest tactics of, just chaining yourself to the fence is nuclear power plant, nuclear arms facility. Just do the same thing from an abortion facility. I don't know who started the first pregnancy resource center because I've met 3 different women who've all said they started the first one. So I don't think anyone really knows. But when I build, the history, the museum for the history of the pro-life movement, just, a history of abortion, when we build that museum, and I want to be on the board of directors of that organization because that is going to be a fun museum to make sure that we can honor those who've been killed, the more than 60 million, who knows how many, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun to be able to say, here's how we did it, and here's how we fought this injustice together, and here's how we won. But anyway, that's another podcast for a different day. When we do that, we'll have to really figure out these answers of who started the first pregnancy resource center and crisis pregnancy center. The first rescue is in 1988 in Philadelphia. You probably have seen the pictures of the rescues. These were Christian-led efforts. There was prayer and singing. The rescues actually started in 88 and they really started to ramp up, but they really started to die down in 1994 when the FACE Act made it a federal crime to blockade abortion facilities. This was after George Tiller had been shot, and Bill Clinton, Janet Reno, and Democrats in Congress passed this FACE Act and make it a federal crime to blockade abortion facilities. It actually makes the entrance into abortion facilities like federally protected land. It's kind of crazy. Thankfully, we don't have the bubble zone laws that they have in Canada where we can actually still do sidewalk counseling and prayer ministries. But if the pro-aborts had their way, we wouldn't be able to get anywhere near an abortion facility ever again. Today, the pregnancy center movement has grown. I mean, there's, I think, upwards, almost close to 3,000 pregnancy resource centers across the country. This is huge. This is, these women and men who serve in these pregnancy centers are really the backbone of our movement, and they're serving the women in need, and they're really building and creating that post-Roe America. And we'll talk about that later. 1989, we have Webster v. Reproductive Health Services decision, in which the Supreme Court found a Washington state law declaring that life begins at conception, and unconstitutional, and also bars the use. There was a law that barred the use of public facilities for abortions. They found that to be unconstitutional. This is a significant case, though, this Webster v. Reproductive Health Services. This is a significant case because for the first time, the Supreme Court does not explicitly reaffirm Roe versus Wade, which in constitutional law is a big deal because you don't really want the court to ever reaffirm itself, its past decisions, because the court, the more it reaffirms itself, the more entrenched, that previous decision has become. The Supreme Court doesn't, it's like a little egotistical person, never likes to reverse itself or likes to ever admit it's bad. That's why the reversal of Roe is going to be a really big deal. And it's why pro-lifers still today remain divided on what, law should be passed to be the challenge to Roe versus Wade. In fact, recently I was getting these texts of a national pro-life group actually lobbied against a pro-life bill in the state of Tennessee. And I understand their reasoning for it because they feel like if this bill would pass, that if the Supreme Court would take it up, they would reaffirm Roe and it could hurt us. So it is very strategic sometimes when we're passing laws, and especially in states that could lead to a Roe reversal, of where do we go? Where do we go here? And is this something that could hurt us when we're trying to get that to that phase one goal in the pro-life movement, which is reverse Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton to send the decision of abortion back to the states. Now in the 90s, we've got, obviously it's the decade of the best music here. You have Nirvana and the Dave Matthews Band. They're born in the 90s, so very important for me personally. 1992 Supreme Court in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. This is one of the biggest abortion decisions ever. This case decides the constitutionality of several Pennsylvania state regulations on abortion. The court, bad news, reaffirms Roe and its core holdings that states can't ban abortion or interfere with a woman's right to abortion. However, the good news is they uphold a mandatory 24-hour waiting period. They uphold parental consent. They uphold parental notification laws. What they do say is spousal notification is unconstitutional, which I think is why we have the current issue we have today of getting young men involved and why young men are told they don't have a say. I also was reading through Casey randomly the other month. I was really pissed off because there's a quote from Kennedy in it that basically says that women need Roe, that women have to have abortion. In order to be equal to men in the workplace, women need Roe. And it's so misogynistic, and it blows my mind how today's feminist movement tries to say that they're for equality, but then they're for abortion, that you're only equal unless you have access to a special surgery. You're only equal unless you kill a human being because you're apparently not strong enough as a woman to be a mom and finish your education or be a mom and have the career you want to have, which is total bullshit. That's total bullshit. I'm sorry. This is explicitly pro-life podcast. So if you get offended by my cursing, I am sorry. I don't think my mom listens to all of them, so I think I'm okay. Okay, so 1992, Casey v. Planned Parenthood. The outcome of this is that it leads the way for incremental pro-life legislation because the court upheld 24-hour waiting periods, parental consent, parental notification. So this is where you really see state right-to-life groups, state pro-life groups really pushing forward quickly a bunch of legislation to restrict abortion, to chip away at Roe as much as they possibly can, to save as many lives right now. Not surprisingly, the Human Life Bill versus Human Life Amendment fight comes back in the 1990s over incremental pro-life legislation. The fight is, if you're for this incremental pro-life legislation, say partial birth abortion ban, which only bans a certain type of abortions, you're not fully pro-life because you're only for banning one type of abortion. And if that you were fully pro-life, you would only support a ban that would ban all abortions, even though that may not be politically possible. This is a fight that's still happening today in the pro-life movement. It kind of died down because people realize, wow, if we pass incremental pro-life laws, we can actually change Americans' minds about abortion, which is what happened with partial birth abortion. I mean, partial birth abortion bills started getting passed in the 90s, states starting picking up, despite, Bill Clinton saying he wanted abortion to be safe, legal, and rare, which, by the way, the left will never say that anymore. They're not even allowed to say that anymore, because by saying abortion should be rare, they're actually admitting they're admitting that abortion, is something that shouldn't be celebrated and done a lot, which admits there's something wrong with abortion. So that's even antiquated language now. But despite saying abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, and trying to win over all these blue dog Democrats, President Clinton vetoes twice the partial birth abortion national bill. It's not actually signed into law until 2000 by President George W. Bush, who up until President Trump, I think I know you could argue was the most pro-life president in terms of actions, credible actions that were taken. So partial birth abortion is huge because if you look at the polling on abortion, we were getting our asses handed to us. Then partial birth abortion legislation comes out. There's a national outcry. There's a national debate. There's National Right to Life put together this 4-box diagram of what happens during a late-term abortion. It's not bloody. It's not gory. It's black and white. That's shown all over C-SPAN. It's shown all over the news. People are up. It's in church bulletins. I mean, people are upset. If you look at the polling on abortion, you will see a significant shift start to occur. I think a large part of that shift is because of education, that we started talking about partial birth abortion, the gruesomeness of what happens during abortion. Even in the 2007 Gonzalez v. Carhart, Gonzalez v. Planned Parenthood decisions, where the Supreme Court finally upheld the partial birth abortion ban act, they actually said, the majority said, this is a really gruesome procedure. This can't ever be, this isn't necessary. And if you want to see pure evil, I challenge you to read Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent in that 2007 case, because it is unbelievable that someone would actually defend killing a baby in such a gruesome way. All right, so that incremental stuff still happening today. I don't want to get into it too much, but we could probably do a whole episode on the heartbeat legislation and pro-lifers who are pro-heartbeat legislation that ban abortions heartbeat, when the heartbeat's detected at 6 weeks, and pro-lifers who are against it. And it's not because pro-lifers are against it think that babies should be aborted. It's because pro-lifers who speak out against the heartbeat bill don't think it's the best legal strategy to overturn Roe. And so this is being fought still today in 2019. And it's a challenge, right? Because as a pro-life movement, we all feel called to this movement. We've all given up. We've all sacrificed something for this movement. We know what's at stake because every single day, 3,000, 2,600, 2,700, 3,000 lives are being ended. Women are being emotionally, physically scarred forever. Families are being torn apart. We know we have to do something here. Moving on, one more thing to mention in the 1990s, Norma McCorvey, the Jane Roe in Roe v. Wade, who, by the way, never actually had an abortion, is befriended by, at the time, the National Director of Operation Rescue, is baptized into Christianity and declares that she is pro-life and regrets her role in the landmark case. And Norma, until the time she died, remained a vocal opponent to abortion. All right, going into the 2000s. So as I mentioned earlier, just a little bit ago, we had these partial birth abortion laws being passed in states. Well, in 2000, the Supreme Court strikes down a Nebraska state ban on partial birth abortion, and Stenberg versus Carhart, calling it unconstitutional. The ruling then invalidates 29 out of 31 existing state laws across the country that ban partial birth abortion. The Born Alive Infants Protection Act is enacted in 2002. This is saying that, human children who are born alive before or after viability, they're legally persons, and that, you can't kill those persons, that infants born alive during abortion deserve medical care. They don't deserve just to be thrown away. This is something that's still being debated today because we've brought it back as the pro-life movement. We want to have penalties. Apparently, when we did this in 2002, I don't know, I was around, there weren't any penalties in the law. But now we want penalties. This is something that I think they've tried since like 80 some times since this January to get the Congress, the House of Representatives, to vote on this, and the Democrats refuse to allow a vote on this. Why? Because they know if they vote on it, it's going to show them for the monsters that they are, and it's going to be used against them in the elections. But they really don't want to have to vote on this because they realize this is something that 99% of Americans agrees with, but Democrats can't vote on it because they're so beholden to Planned Parenthood, and Planned Parenthood is uniformly opposed to this, because anything like this of saying if a baby's born alive during an abortion procedure, you're actually admitting what happens during an abortion, which is that a baby is murdered. So 2003, Congress finally passes. George W. Bush signs into law the partial birth abortion ban. Let's see, 2004, district courts in California, New York, Nebraska all declare this partial birth abortion ban to be unconstitutional. That leads us to the 2007 case, which was a victory. 2004, you have the Unborn Victims of Violence Act. That's huge. I mean, still today, you have like the Lacey and Connor Pearson law in states like California, which recognize that if a pregnant woman is murdered, that person that murders her can be tried for 2 homicides, but yet, if she chooses to murder and kill her child and pay somebody else to do it, then it's not murder, and the child was nothing but a blob of tissue. So you even have today, even in our laws, even in states like California, on one hand, it's a human being that has rights, that has value, and the other hand, it's absolutely nothing. Like, this doesn't make sense. No wonder why people are confused. A date to remember: the 2000s, 2006, Students for Life of America. We open our national headquarters. It's me and one other person. And we launch our field program, our national field program, and our full-time operations. 2007, I'd like to mention, my good friend David B. Wright launches 4 Days for Life, the national campaign. To show you how much I know, when David met with me, told me he was going to do it, I thought he was crazy and no one would do it. So it tells you how much I know. All right, so you got 2007, you got Gonzales v. Carhart, Gonzales v. Planned Parenthood. Once again, check out Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent if you need some outrage in your day. 2008, Barack Obama was elected president. He vows to sign FOCA, the Freedom of Choice Act, which is the behemoth of all pro-abortion legislation. Everyone speaks out against FOCA. Now it has another name, but it's basically the same thing. And they're going to try, as soon as a Democrat's elected to be president, to pass the same thing. Things I like to remember about this: December 2008, a former Students for Life intern named Lila Rose releases an undercover investigation she did while she was an intern at Students for Life, exposing multiple Planned Parenthoods for accepting donations for Black-only abortions. This kind of kicks off this outrage. The entire spring of 2009, you've got all kinds of protests that are being launched. Actually, sorry, this was December 2007. Lila releases Undercover Project, because in the spring 2008, we were able to organize the first ever defund Planned Parenthood protest. So this was spring 2008. This is where I became friends with Congressman Mike Pence, this congressman from Indiana, because he had written a law to defund Planned Parenthood. And this is why today Students for Life is able to go to the White House and meet with Vice President Pence, because we were able to establish that relationship so long ago. What was surprising to me was when I looked at the history of the movement, we really actually haven't been focusing our laser beams on Planned Parenthood, defunding Planned Parenthood that long. It's only been about 11 years. We've actually come a very far way. I remember that time very clearly at Students for Life because it was spring of 2008. I was working with all these African-American pastors to speak out against the racist business practices of Planned Parenthood. I got to organize all these fun protests. I was the only white girl on most of them, so I wasn't even, I wasn't the one on TV. This is all about the pastors, not about me. But I remember clearly because I was pregnant with Gunnar and throwing up. So I remember all of them because I remember where I threw up before each of them because I had horrible, horrible morning sickness during that time. October 2009, I'm at an event with David B. Wright in Mississippi. We're doing a pro-life unity event, trying to gather all the pro-life leaders in Mississippi together to work together to end abortion. David calls me out to the hall, starts crying, and tells me Abby Johnson just walked into our office in College Station and she's quitting Planned Parenthood. That is a day I will never forget. And obviously we know how the power of Abby's story. 2009, we start fighting Obamacare. So this is one of the promises that President Obama makes is he's going to pass this quasi-public, quasi-private Obamacare system, which we all know is a failure, which is why the Democrats are proposing Medicare for all, government-funded healthcare for all, which is going to be crap. This is a huge fight that starts in 2009, goes into 2010. It eventually gets passed, signed into law. We're betrayed by a few pro-life Democrats on Capitol Hill. It kind of signals the death of pro-life Democrats. Still today, I think there's like one federally elected Democrat, Congressman Dan Lipinski, who has been consistent in his pro-life beliefs. And it's actually a pretty sad state, which, I talked earlier about the extremism of the DNC, adopting that platform, even calling for the repeal of Hyde. Because, if you think about it as a pro-life movement, we're not a partisan movement at all. We're made up of people of all different political beliefs. Hell, ask my staff, ask the student leaders that we serve at Students for Life. And if we want to get serious about ending abortion, if we want to have a pro-life nation, we need both political parties to be pro-life. We actually need them fighting over our votes, saying, no, we're more pro-life. We're more anti-abortion. And so this is a really sad state of affairs. And it just shows you we're not there yet, folks. We have more work to do. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. 2015, David Daleiden, who worked with Lila when he was a student at Live Action, he goes off, launches Center for Medical Progress. He releases the baby body parts investigation, which is huge. It's still, Planned Parenthood is still being federally investigated by the DOJ, Department of Justice. If the DOJ would actually get their act together, get their findings released, it could ban Planned Parenthood and from getting any federal funds because they have, we know that they were doing things that were illegal, like selling the body parts of human beings, because I've actually personally have held the receipts in my hands that Planned Parenthood sent the universities, Planned Parenthood Gulf Coast sent universities detailing the body parts and the charge for every single body part that they sold them for research. This is something that we as a pro-life movement need to keep talking about. Planned Parenthood just did this whole PR blitz after it happened saying, these are fake, these are fake, these are fake. Guess what? David just won in the Ninth Circuit, the most liberal, most pro-abortion circuit in the United States, just won his case because guess what? He wasn't lying. The tapes were real. And hopefully we'll be talking about that more and more in the pro-life movement. So I've kind of got you up to speed. I don't think I need to go much further than 2015. I think everyone's been around paying attention since then. Things that you have to be aware of is, there's definitely been a quickening in, the pro-life movement, the pro-abortion fight, since 2016, since the election of Donald Trump. The pro-life movement was definitely divided. When President Trump was running for president, he was not my first choice for president. I'll tell you that right now. because he was pro-choice before he ran for president. And then all of a sudden he said he's pro-life. And then he made these great promises, which he was the first presidential candidate ever to make these promises, saying that he would sign legislation to defund Planned Parenthood, uphold Hyde, expand Mexico City policy, only appoint pro-life Supreme Court justices. I got behind the president. Others got behind him saying, look, even if he turns out to be a great failure and do nothing, he's going to be better than the alternative, which is Hillary Clinton. And we knew what was going to happen. Planned Parenthood might as well set up shop right there in the West Wing and paint it pink. But we've been pleasantly surprised, I think, everyone in the pro-life movement, of so much of what's happened, because personnel is policy and the president has appointed great people in his administration to do good pro-life things and uphold his promises and pledges to us. But things have escalated since then. Since President Trump has been sworn into office, that first year, we had the most free speech lawsuits and cases and vandalization and violence attempts on college campuses. The left, the political left, the pro-abortion left feels emboldened. They feel desperate. And so, that scene we had with Judge Kavanaugh when he was confirmed to the Supreme Court, of the women clawing at the doors of the Supreme Court. I don't know what the hell they thought they were going to do. It was like a weekend when it happened. But that scene of the women clawing at the doors of the Supreme Court, that is a scene that I think we should all be thinking about as we move forward into the 2020 election. Because, if you're a person who doesn't like controversy, I have some really bad news for you. It's not going to get better. If President Trump wins re-election, if we get to put that number 6 and that number 7 pro-life Supreme Court justice, which I believe we need, because I don't think our current Supreme Court on a 5-4 decision will reverse Roe, because judicial conservatives tend to be a little wussy, not like to cause controversy, and they don't like to make sure the Supreme Court upholds its prestige and doesn't overturn itself. I think we're going to need 6 or 7, and I think the political left, the pro-abortion left, knows this. That scene, that clawing at the Supreme Court doors, is nothing as to what we're going to see. I anticipate that there will be violence. The left, the pro-abortion movement will seek violence. This year, for example, Students for Life, the first time ever, we're having a back-to-school webcast. Welcome back to school. Here's how to protect yourself against violence. Here's what to look for. And there's a reason we're doing this, because things are escalating. Things are changing. It's happening. Don't think for a moment that the abortion industry, that Planned Parenthood, is going to go down without a fight, because this is part of their ideology. This is part of the culture of death. It is part of who they are. And they are not going to just accept a reversal of Roe, this decision of abortion back to the states. Take that lightly. Other things to take away from the history of the pro-life movement, and I am sorry if you might have to re-listen and take some notes, because I went through things so fast, but we had a lot to cram in. I think it's important to remember, the house divided itself cannot stand. We've seen this time and time again, the pro-life movement, where infighting over strategies has actually hurt us. In the 1980s, we could have ended abortion, but we began to fight. It's so frustrating when you look at that. How many millions of lives could we have saved had we not begun fighting and turned in on ourselves? And this still happens today. This is actually one of the challenges I have for young people that I talk to about the pro-life history is, when you're a leader, when you're leading a pregnancy center, when you're leading a right to life group, remember this. Remember how disgusted you feel when I talk about this, because don't fall into this. I think it's also important to note from this history that effective changes happen at the grassroots level. Look at what the pregnancy center movement has accomplished. Look at what state laws do. State laws matter. Judges matter. Here's another takeaway. Judges matter. If you don't vote on any other issue, if you don't care about any other issue, you have to care about abortion. You have to care about the Supreme Court. And I'm going to be a broken freaking record until end of November 2020 that judges matter. That 2020 presidential election, is about one thing and one thing only, and that is the Supreme Court of the United States. And if you don't like it, then you don't have to live here. But that is how our representative democracy has been set up. And the Supreme Court matters, baby. And it's hanging. Roe is hanging by a thread. The abortion industry knows this. They're openly saying it now. But we can't lose this election. We can't afford to lose election, because millions of lives hang in the balance. And that's just the reality. I know people are like, oh, Kristan, but you say every election is so important, blah, 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 blah. This one really counts. This one really matters. Don't walk away from this. Don't walk away from this. I think another takeaway is that, we need Democrats and Republicans. We need both. We need a diverse pro-life movement. That throughout our history in the pro-life movement, we've actually been a diverse movement made of people of different faiths, different religions, different races, different backgrounds. I think it's important to note in the 1990s when I was talking about the polls changing and how the partial birth abortion fight, I think was critical for changing people's opinions. The other things that was critical of changing people's opinions, invention of ultrasound, mainstream use of the ultrasound, the fact that every single one of us have seen our brothers and sisters in the womb, our cousins, our children in the womb. The fact that women who were harmed by abortion started speaking out. I think the abortion industry knows they're losing. I think they know that history is not on their side. They understand this. That's why they're giving it all. That's why they're fighting the way they're fighting. And so the question I have for you all today, and something I want you to think about in this coming week, is what are you doing to step up? What are you doing to step up and fight harder than you ever fought before? Because we have a long history in the pro-life movement, and we have a lot of things to be proud of. We have some things to be ashamed of in the pro-life movement, but we have never shut up. That is the difference between us and every other country in the history of the world who's fighting abortion. The difference is the Americans haven't shut up. That is what the pro-aborts want more than anything else. They want this to go away. They don't want this to be an issue. They want us to become like Europe when this is becoming, a non-controversial thing. The reason we are still here today is because we refuse to be silent. We became those annoying people who talked about abortion wherever we go, who put the bumper stickers on a car, who wore the t-shirt or continue to wear the t-shirts, by the way, with some great merchandise at studentsforlife.org. We became those annoying people. We refuse to be silent. So what are you doing? What are you doing to contribute to the history of this pro-life movement? To be a part of it? And I can't guarantee you when we build that museum, the museum of abortion, where remember all those who've been lost to us from abortion, all those who've been hurt, all those who've been wounded. When we remember all of these warriors who fought in this cause, I can't guarantee you that you're going to be in that museum. Hell, I'm not going to be in that museum. But we don't do it. We don't do it for the glory. We do it because we know it's right. And we do it because we know that every single day that abortion is allowed in this country, thousands are dying. And that you can save a life. So what are you doing? And what can you do better? How can you fight harder? So thanks for tuning in this week to Explicitly Pro-Life. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you spread the word about this podcast and get others listening. Make sure you put some comments down at YouTube if you have questions, or you can find me on Instagram, Kristan Mercer Hawkins. Comment, let me know what you want to hear more of, what you want to hear less of. Sorry about the cursing, Mom. And just let me know your thoughts. Thanks, guys.